concern for a lot of people. What if the U.S. citizen doesn't make enough money to sponsor the spouse, or it appears that they don't? What's the deal with joint sponsors? How do you overcome that? It's kind of a broad question. I guess, first of all, just to kind of set up the question before I pass to Megan.
Yeah, go for it.
How do you know if you make enough money? How do you know if you make enough money to sponsor your spouse? There is actually a chart available online, and it's on Form I-864P. And it shows, based on the number of people in your household and the dependents you have, plus the immigrant, how much money you actually have to make. So it varies based on your personal situation. But so most people who ask this question have somehow discovered that chart or heard about it, and they have a general idea that, I looked and it was like 4 people, and I don't make that much currently. So then they start to wonder, how can I overcome this? Does that mean that my spouse, can't come to the US, or what happens next?
Yeah, definitely. And when that is a very frequent question, and it's good that people are thinking about that, because it's one of the the ducks you want to have in a row to get started. But when people tell us that, we do a little bit of a deeper inquiry first before we jump to the joint sponsor. Sometimes people actually do qualify.
Absolutely.
They can qualify by using your assets too. So if you own a home, or you have a retirement account or savings and things like that, we ask a lot of questions about that to really figure out what assets you have available, because we can use those to show that, yes, you maybe make X amount, but your assets can make up the difference. And if the calculation, immigration has a calculation that they use, that the assets have to be the difference, it has to be 3 times. But that's all in the form, and we would help with that. But that's the first step. And then, do you want to talk about joint sponsors? Then, if the assets would work.
So we'll try our other tricks, because certainly if you can avoid needing a joint sponsor, that's always ideal. Just less complication, less fewer documents, things like that. But so for people who can't qualify financially themselves as the petitioner, then we do look at a joint sponsor, which is another great option. And for some people, it's a really straightforward thing. Basically, a joint sponsor can be anybody who is either a U.S. citizen, or they have a green card, like they're a lawful permanent resident. They have to be at least 18, and they have to actually reside in the U.S. They can't be expats that reside permanently abroad, even if they're U.S. citizens. Those are the core requirements for who the joint sponsor is. So you're not tied to just your family or things like that. It could be a friend. It could be someone you work with, your boss. We've seen people have different relationships with people who want to help them through the process. So the things that we'll be looking at for the joint sponsor, assuming they meet those basic requirements, then we look at the joint sponsor's household income and how many people they have in their household. So we use that same chart we mentioned earlier to figure out whether the person qualifies as a joint sponsor or not. In general, I would say that sometimes people tend to think, okay, I'm going to think of like the wealthiest person I know, and that might not necessarily be your best joint sponsor, because one of the most important things is that the person have a very clear, a clear paper trail of what their income is. So sometimes if someone's, for example, a business owner, it gets a little bit more complicated, because if they're doing excellent tax planning, it's like, yes, they're a wealthy person that owns this business, but somehow all of their stuff is basically like a business expense, and it looks like they don't make that much money on paper. And and that can be totally legal under a U.S. tax law. That there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. It's just that for immigration purposes, the taxes have to show, okay, you're making a significant amount of money that meets this chart. So sometimes people's best option is actually, somebody who's like young and single and like makes $25,000 a year. It's like, boom, joint sponsor. Ironically, that can be sometimes less messy than a joint sponsor who has kids and a business and more complications. It's really counterintuitive, I would say. But so basically, the joint sponsor is going to need to show their current income. They're going to need to show their last 3 years of tax filings in the U.S. And, joint sponsors can also, sometimes you have a joint sponsor who's retired or something like that, and they are also just showing assets. So it's not necessarily income. So sometimes, someone will have maybe their grandparent or something, and they're showing, yes, I have a pension and I have retirement savings, and that's how I'm going to qualify as a joint sponsor. So it's really specific for each case, but that's the general idea of who would need a sponsor and like how you would find the sponsor. And we obviously will help people who are representing find that person and vet that person and make sure that it actually does will be the person that will work for them to meet that requirement before they get started.
Definitely. And sometimes, one last thing, sometimes people that are petitioning for their spouse or their fiance, sometimes they might be students and they're transitioning into a job and they actually would make it up for that job. Or we've actually seen people, as they're looking for a joint sponsor, they get promoted or they apply and got another job. And the amount that they'll be making at that job, if it ends up being more, they might be able to qualify. So if something like that happens, pay attention to that, and you might make enough, and you don't have to go down that whole rabbit hole with a joint sponsor. So
exactly. Sometimes having a side gig that pays money just to bump you over the amount is the easiest thing to do, and comes in handy anyway for all those filing fees for the government, right?
Yep.